Recently, China's MOFA claimed that the Taiwan Strait is not international waters, and Xi Jinping signed into law the power to conduct military operations other than war, which to many sounds very much like what Russia is doing to Ukraine now. So what do you think? What is Beijing's calculus behind all these notions? And do you think Beijing would mimic what Russia has done to Ukraine?
We have to understand that for China, this has come quite a long way. If you recall a number of years back, when Chinese expatriates found themselves under danger overseas. For example, in Pakistan in the recent years, Chinese nationals have been targeted in the various terrorist attacks in Pakistan, especially those that were connected to the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor project. And after which, the Chinese authorities had already started talking about conducting operations other than war overseas. And thereby that also means, just recently, I think that was around late last year or so, the Chinese government amended their national law, the law of national defense. And that definitely included the use of military force in protection of so-called developmental rights, which is something that is new to the amendment to the law of national defense. So I think if we look at the current context of the new directive that was signed by Chairman Xi Jinping, I think it's clear that there is a natural progression from the previous developments. However, of course, if China wanted to use, so-called operations other than war to describe its operation against Taiwan, then I think more accurately, we could think about operations that lie more in the gray zone dimension, gray zone activities that allow the Chinese to actually use force to a limited extent to achieve limited objectives in the Taiwan Strait without necessarily resorting to full-scale conflict, which obviously will go outside the ambit of operations other than war itself. So I don't think the Chinese were trying to emulate what the Russians were doing in the case of so-called naming their invasion of Ukraine as a special military operation. I don't think that is the intention. I think the Chinese were more straightforward in describing whatever the operations the PLA will undertake in that sense.
But how high do you think the risk is for China to take military actions over Taiwan? Because all these actions, it sounds an alarm to Western countries, also, of course, to Taiwan, all this Ukraine war, and also what Wei Fenghe, the Chinese defense minister, said at the Shangri-La Forum. He said, China is willing to go to war under certain circumstances. And that sounds an alarm to the international community. How high do you think the risk is now?
I think as for now, the likelihood doesn't at least appear to be high compared to before the Ukraine crisis, for a very simple reason that the PLA has been trying to emulate the Russian military for many years. Because, being short of given the opportunity to examine and to learn upfront, Western military practices, the Russian military has provided, the key learning points for the PLA. We saw before the Ukraine crisis in the recent years, the PLA had engaged in a number of joint exercises with the Russians with the express intention to try to extract, good lessons from Russia. But if anything, the initial phases of the Ukraine war, especially the phases surrounding Kiev, where Russia actually found itself underperforming to its beyond within expectation, it somewhat would have prompted the Chinese to rethink, whether they should actually push forward if it is really the case, any plans for Taiwan invasion, or at the very least, whatever invasion plans they have in the drawer right now will have to be taken out and have to be taken apart, and thereby they have to draw lessons from the Ukraine war and use that to revise their invasion plan, which means this will require some time for them. And in any case, it appears that because the war is dragging on, it will take a longer time for the PLA to draw the full lessons. And those lessons are not necessarily just military, it also involves strategic lessons. I believe the Beijing will be interested to see how Russia's economy holds up against the unprecedented sanctions and use that as a way to gauge the potential reactions from the international community in the conduct of any Taiwan Strait invasion, in a sense. But that being the case, it's clear that the PLA modernization has reached a point where they have accumulated more or less the necessary tools to conduct the invasion in that regard. So I think it is therefore, not a wise thing to discount the likelihood of gray zone operations that China will be conducting to gradually erode or undermine Taiwanese ability or will to defend itself or safeguard itself during this dangerous period.
If I ask, like, how much time does it take for them to be ready? 5, 10 years?
Well, I don't think I'm in the position to give a ballpark figure, but if we have to really beggar an estimation, 10 years, 5 to 10 years or so, it will require them to really train up. Because right now, if anything, the timetable could be shrunk further because all this training and all this indoctrination will be hastened if they have the right tools at their disposal. And right now, of course, the PLA modernization has started with hardware and software modernization, which thereby means that right now they have some of those necessary tools in place that allow them to evaluate and to test out those concepts. They need to experiment those concepts. So that will require at least 5 years, if I could put a rough figure on that. And barring any potential disturbances along the way, I think 5 years will be safe to imagine, of course, and it might potentially put the PLA on the timetable to become a strong military by 2030 or so. So I think that time frame is more or less correct. But an invasion of Taiwan within the next 2 years, I don't think that's likely. I think it will require the PLA to take a little bit longer to evaluate the lessons from Ukraine and thereby adapt them adequately. They need to experiment them, test them out, and thereby validate those concepts before they could put them into real application in a war scenario.
What about for Taiwan, right? What are some most urgent things if you give them 5 years or 10 years, right? What about for Taiwan? What are some most urgent things Taiwan needs to do to beef up its defense?
Wow, this is a very complex question. I have many responses to that. I think one is certainly to ensure that notwithstanding which political party takes control of the government, there must be consistent defense spending and investment. I think that is a very important task, and that investment takes into account both the day-to-day routine operations as well as to further modernize the Taiwanese military, as well as what we saw today, given the PLA flybys and sail pass around Taiwan that has become more regular these days. It does strain the existing Taiwanese forces. We're talking about existing machines as well as existing limited manpower. And that is I would say, reflected in the recent mishaps by the ROC Air Force. I think that somewhat reflects the age of the Air Force and the amount of strain put on manpower as well as machine. So that investment is already critical to upkeep these operations on the daily basis against Chinese intrusions into the air defense identification zone, for example. And what more to talk about investments into new capabilities. So I think that is the first part. The second, of course, I believe Taiwan does need to overhaul its military command and control structure. I think that is largely based on very old command and control structure that dated back to the Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's era. I think that military command and control structure needs to be revamped. It needs to be more modernized. There needs to be more emphasis on non-commissioned officers instead of just officers. So I think that is the second area. The third area is something that the Taiwanese military has been embarking in the recent years, which is on their missile capabilities. Because if anything, the current defense strategy that puts emphasis on asymmetric responses to China's invasion or other scenario shouldn't prejudice the idea that you need to have what we call deterrence by punishment, meaning you need to have the right capabilities to impose higher costs on the aggressor. In that sense, we are talking about long-range missile systems, which is something that I believe the Taiwan Ministry of National Defense has been investing. So that requires consistent investments in that regard. And the final thing that I thought is necessary is certainly to improve the welfare of soldiers. I think that is something that has sort of emerged over time in Taiwan about, inconsistent or poorly managed welfare for soldiers. We're talking about rank and file. There were, reports about abuse of authority and other instances where soldiers were not treated properly, and that has an impact on morale. I mean, if you're talking about wartime, morale is important. And what we saw in the case of Ukraine is that you wouldn't just need the right tools to fight. You need to have the right morale to fight. And the Ukrainian defenders had held up for these many months. It is in large part due to high morale amongst the defenders. So I think this is a lesson that the Taiwanese military would need to draw from in their preparation for potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait.
China just launched its third and most advanced aircraft carrier. How much does that enhance China's power projection capabilities, and how does that change the dynamics in the South China Sea and the East China Sea?
These goes down to the very technical specifications of the carrier itself. It is unlike the Liaoning and the Shandong. The Liaoning and Shandong were actually configured for ski jump. And you can see the angle of flight deck is very clear. The problem with ski jump, because it was in the absence of a conventional takeoff mechanism or a catapult, right? That a ski jump does impose physical limitations on a few technical aspects. One of which being that any jet fighter that needs to take off from ski jump cannot take off with a full load. And that limits the combat effectiveness or potential of the aircraft in question, right? And ski jump also does impose limitations on the number of aircraft that could be launched at any one point of time as well. There are clear limitations on that. And the other thing that is of interest here is that this new carrier is comparable in size to the latest American carrier, which belongs to the Ford class. So they're comparable in size, and it means that the new carrier Fujian is able to carry a larger aviation complement. And at the same time, they use conventional and electromagnetic catapult and takeoff system, which thereby means they could increase the turnaround rate for aircraft, meaning aircraft that they launch and they recover, and then they'll do refueling, rearming, and then they'll send them back to combat. This turnaround factor is important in any fluid naval warfare. And that is well highlighted in the previous wars we saw. For example, the Battle of Midway back in the Second World War. These are important factors to consider for the generation of combat power in any naval campaign. So that means, essentially, with this new carrier, it has served as somewhat, I call, a game changer for the PLA Navy. It actually allows the PLA Navy to further revisit and to revise its carrier operating doctrine. It actually allows China to actually, embark on more complex joint operations and exercises together, not just within the PLA Navy itself, but also in conjunction with other PLA services to achieve jointness. So that is, what I would see as, potential, boost to China's force projection capabilities. And that isn't just only the case, because most people focus on the carrier itself. But most people may actually overlook the fact that the PLA Navy in the recent years have been commissioning many new surface combatants, as well as new fleet replenishment vessels. These are important in the formation of a carrier strike group or battle group. So it's not just a carrier itself. So these developments are also equally important. So going forward, we are going to see the PLA Navy further increase the number of carrier battle groups that it could field. At the same time, given the new carrier that is entering service not long later, it will allow the PLA Navy to further refine its carrier doctrine and capabilities.
Given that China is expanding its military powers so much and so rapidly, and expanding its presence in the region, what should the US do in response?
Going forward, the more sustainable way, which I believe the US could do to offset the growing PLA military capabilities, would be to continue to put more emphasis on its existing network of security allies and partners. I think that is certainly a theme that the Biden administration has put front and center for its policy. But going forward, it will only mean that this is going to be increasingly more important, right? It will require the US military to promote deeper and better interoperability with its, foreign military counterparts in the Indo-Pacific. It will require, more cooperation in, for example, defense industrial aspects. It require, for example, more exchanges between the military establishment and to come up with new alternatives to deal with, the ongoing evolving landscape, especially when it comes to gray zone, for example. I think that is something that, the US and its regional allies and partners ought to be, focused in looking at.